Oh,
he wasn't at full volume, I told you, because people are talking. So yeah. Yeah, but sure you can't. Okay. No.
Turn the mic on. Didn't want to interfere with your...
We will when we start. Yeah, it hasn't started. Yeah, no, not yet. I'm going to say hello, and so don't play it because I'm leaving. Yeah. Okay. Okay, guys, we're ready to go. Thank you. Welcome everyone to the Irish American Heritage Museum and our Christmas show, A Child's Christmas in Wales. I don't even know how many years, there 6 or 7. It's a lovely tradition that we're doing here and various other places. So we're delighted to have the ensemble back. Thank you all for joining. And everyone online, I hope you can hear us. We're doing as best we can with these hybrid situations. So welcome everyone. Have a great Christmas, or Nolik Hana Dit, as we say at home in Ireland, and Sláinte if you're having a drink. And everyone stay safe and have a great holiday. Thank you. Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here tonight. And thank you, Elizabeth, for that welcome. And thanks to Don for strumming us in with Christmas music.
Thank you.
Let's see. So tonight we're beginning our holiday season with our annual reading of Dylan Thomas's The Child's Christmas in Wales. The themes running through the evening are holiday memories. Dylan Thomas tells us about his childhood Christmases, and we hope this will get you thinking about all of your childhood Christmases as well. My name is Meg Carroll, and I'd like to begin by telling you a few words about the reading you're going to hear tonight, and about a little bit about Welsh poet Dylan Thomas. And by the way, the Welsh are always considered the Irish cousins, the Celtic cousins, so we welcome the Welsh. So I'll tell you a little bit about Dylan Thomas, then introduce you to the story before the reading begins. After the reading, we're hoping that you will share some of your childhood memories of Christmas as well. And we're going to also ask you to participate in the show a little bit by singing some Christmas carols. We've integrated some Christmas carols into the reading. Don will give us the cue when the song is about to begin. And their songs probably you all know, so please sing up. Let's see, so now a few words about our author and a few words about the story. Dylan Thomas is one of the 20th century's most important and beloved lyric poets. He was born in Swansea, Wales on October 27th, 1914, and he said of the time and the place he was born, quote, "I was born in a large Welsh industrial town at the beginning of the Great War, an ugly, lovely town, or so it was and is to me," end quote. Thomas inherited his love of language from both his father's love of poetry, his father's love of Shakespeare. His father used to read Shakespeare to him as a bedtime story, and also from his mother's ear for the colloquial. One critic said of Florence Thomas, she had, quote, "a great ear for dialogue and relayed the local gossip with verve." Thomas applies both influences to his wonderful poetry and what he called his plays for voices, such as Under Milk Wood and the sweet and funny story we'll hear tonight, A Child's Christmas in Wales. Even though Dylan Thomas was not fluent in the Welsh language, his parents were, and they passed along the rhythm, musicality, and a way of forming ideas and images of the native Welsh. A Child's Christmas in Wales is especially wonderful to read aloud and to hear the voices of his childhood and the musical sounds and rhythms and the tongue-twisting string of words that you'll hear tonight from our readers that were influenced by the Welsh language. Thomas started writing poetry as a boy, and while he dropped out of school at 16, writing is how he made his living. Even as a high school student, he got a job as a reporter. Then he began to write and publish poetry, and he would read his poetry to live audiences and on the Welsh BBC. Such was his popularity that he gave readings to packed auditoriums on a US tour in the 1950s. Sadly, his personal life was not very happy, however, was scarred by marital infidelity, by alcohol abuse. He died of alcohol poisoning in New York City in 1953, only 39 years old. His difficulties in adulthood perhaps explain why the stories and plays and poems that look with longing at a simpler, more innocent time appealed to him. A Child's Christmas in Wales is a nostalgic review of life for a little boy in Wales during the 1920s. The story was published in 1954, a year after he died, but an earlier version began 12 years earlier in 1942 for a radio talk show on the Welsh BBC called Reminiscences of Childhood. The urge to reminisce about a more innocent time is strong in the adult Thomas, as I've already mentioned, but he's not only responding to his personal life, he's also responding to the horrors of World War II in what he writes, in particular, the devastation in Wales itself. In February 1941, his ugly, lovely town was destroyed by 3 nights of German bombs, killing 230 people and obliterating over 800 buildings. Thomas was in Swansea during the 3-night splits, and years later he said, quote, "I went out of the hotel into the snow and walked down the high street, past the flat, white wastes where all the shops had been, down Castle Street, past the remembered invisible shops. Our Swansea has died, our Swansea has died," end quote. A Child's Christmas in Wales is an effort to resurrect his Swansea, his family, and his own childhood. The story moves quickly from winter episode to winter episode, with a primary focus resting on how full of adventure the world appears to be through the eyes of a little boy with his life still before him, and how especially magical life is at Christmas. The narrative has 2 primary voices: the adult poet, who is remembering with longing the Christmases of his youth, and the poet as a little boy, who occasionally prompts his adult self to stop all that sentimental blathering and focus on matters much more important, like snowballs and presents and sweets. We also hear the voices of other children from Thomas's youth. The story is clearly connected to his childhood memories of Swansea. For us readers and audience, we cannot help but think back to our own innocent days. One critic writes, quote, "The story reflects the childish mind hidden inside everyone." And as Kathy McCarthy, a museum member and spouse of one of our readers tonight, said, "The story will make you think of every holiday you have ever loved." We'll set the mood with a song, the first verse of the first Noel, and then jump right into the story. Thank you.
Noel, the angels did say, was a certain poor shepherds in fields as they lay, in fields as they keeping their sheep on a cold winter night that was so deep. Noel, 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 born is the King of Israel.
One Christmas was so much like another in those years around the Seatown corner now, out of all sound except the distant speaking of the voices I sometimes hear before sleep. That I never remember whether it snowed for 6 days and 6 nights when I was 12, or whether it snowed for 12 days and 12 nights when I was 6.
All the Christmases rolled down toward the two-tongued sea like a cold and headlong moon bundling down that sky. That was our street. And they stop at the rim of the ice-edged, fish-freezing waves. And I plunge my hands in the snow and bring out whatever I can find. In goes my hand into that wool-white, bell-tongued ball of holidays, resting at the rim of the carol-singing sea. And out comes Mrs. Prothero and the fireman.
It was on the afternoon of the day of Christmas Eve, and I was in Mrs. Prothero's garden waiting for cats with her son Jim. It was snowing. It was always snowing at Christmas. December in my memory is white as Lapland, although there were no reindeers. But there were cats. Patient, cold, and callous, our hands wrapped in socks, we waited to snowball the cats. Sleek and long as jaguars and horrible whiskered, spitting and snarling, they would slide and sidle over the white back garden walls, and the lynx-eyed hunters, Jim and I, fur-capped and moccasin trappers from Hudson Bay off Mumbles Road, would hurl our deadly snowballs at the green of their eyes.
The wise cats never appeared. We were so still, Eskimo-footed Arctic marksmen in the muffling silence of the eternal snows, eternal ever since Wednesday, that we never heard Mrs. Prothero's first cry from her igloo at the bottom of the garden. Or, if we heard it at all, it was, to us, like a far-off challenge of our enemy and prey, the neighbor's polar cat. But soon the voice grew louder. "Fire!" cried Mrs. Prothero, and she beat the dinner gong.
And we ran down the garden with the snowballs in our hands towards the house. And smoke indeed was pouring out of the dining room, and the gong was bomulating, and Mrs. Prothero was announcing ruin like a town crier in Pompeii. This was better than all the cats in Wales, standing on the wall in a row. We bounded into the house laden with snowballs and stopped at the open door of the smoke-filled room.
Something was burning all right. Perhaps it was Mr. Prothero, who always slept there after midday dinner with a newspaper over his face. But he was standing in the middle of the room saying, "A fine Christmas," and smacking at the smoke with a slipper.
"Call the fire brigade," cried Mrs. Prothero as she beat the gong.
They won't be here, said Mr. Prothero. It's Christmas.
There was no fire to be seen, only clouds of smoke, and Mr. Prothero standing in the middle of them, waving his slipper as though he were conducting.
"Do something," he said.
And we all threw our snowballs into the smoke. I think we missed Mr. Prothero and ran out of the house to the telephone box.
"Let's call the police as well," Jim said.
And the ambulance.
And Ernie Jenkins, he likes fires.
But we only called the fire brigade, and soon the fire engine came, and 3 tall men in helmets brought a hose into the house, and Mr. Prothero got out just in time before they turned it on. Nobody could have had a noisier Christmas Eve. And when the firemen turned off the hose and were standing in the wet, smoky room, Jim's aunt, Miss Prothero, came downstairs and peered in at them. Jim and I waited very quietly to hear what she would say to them. Well, she said the right thing always. She looked at the 3 tall firemen in their shining helmets, standing among the smoke and cinders and dissolving snowballs, and she said, "Would you like anything to read?"
Oh, little town of Bethlehem, how still we see thee lie above thy deep and dreamless sleep, the silent stars go by. Yet in thy dark street shineth everlasting light. The
and fears of all the years are met in thee tonight.
Years and years ago, when I was a boy, when there were wolves in Wales and birds the color of red flannel petticoats whisked past the harp-shaped hills, when we sang and wallowed all night and day in caves that smelt like Sunday afternoons in damp farmhouse front parlors, and we chased with the jawbones of deacons the English and the bear. Before the motor car, before the wheel, before the Duchess-faced horse, when we rode the daft and happy hills bareback, it snowed and it snowed.
But here a small boy says,
It snowed last year too. I made a snowman and my brother knocked it down. And I knocked my brother down. And then we had tea.
But that was not the same snow, I say. Our snow was not only shaken from whitewashed buckets down the sky, it came shawling out of the ground and swam and drifted out of the arms and hands and bodies of the trees. Snow grew overnight on the roofs of the houses like a pure and grandfather moss, minutely ivied the walls and settled on the postman opening the gate like a dumb, numb thunderstorm of white, torn Christmas cards.
Were there postmen then too?
With sprinkling eyes and wind-cherried noses, on spread frozen feet they crunched up to the doors and mittened on them manfully. But all that the children could hear was a ringing of bells.
You mean that the postman went rat-a-tat-tat and the doors rang?
I mean that the bells that the children could hear were inside them.
I only heard thunder sometimes, never bells.
There were church bells too.
Inside them?
No. In the black snow-white belfries, tugged by bishops and storks. And they rang their tidings over the bandaged town, over the frozen foam of the powder and ice cream hills, over the crackling sea. It seemed that all the churches boomed for joy under my window, and the weathercocks crew for Christmas on our fence.
Get back to the postman.
Well, they were just ordinary postmen, fond of walking and dogs and Christmas and the snow. They knocked on the doors with blue knuckles.
Ours has got a black knocker.
and then they stood on the white welcome mat in the little drifted porches and huffed and puffed, making ghosts with their breath, and jogged from foot to foot like small boys wanting to go out.
And then the presents?
And then the presents. After the Christmas box and the cold postman with a rose on his button nose tingled down the tea tray slithered run of the chilly glinting hill. He went in his ice-bound boots like a man on fishmonger's slabs. He wagged his bag like a frozen camel's hump, dizzily turned the corner on one foot, and by God, he was gone.
God rest ye merry gentlemen, let nothing you dismay. Remember Christ our Savior was born on Christmas Day to save us all from Satan's power when we were gone astray. Oh, tidings of comfort and joy, comfort and joy. Oh, tidings of comfort and joy.
Get back to the presents.
There were the useful presents, engulfing mufflers of the old coach days, and mittens made for giant sloths, zebra scarves of a substance like silky gum that could be tug-of-war down to the galoshes, blinding tam-o'-shanters like patchwork tea cozies, and bunny-suited busbies and balaclavas for victims of head-shrinking tribes. From aunts who always wore wool next to the skin, where they mustached, and rasping vests that made you wonder why the aunts had any skin at all. And once I had a little crocheted nose bag from an aunt now, alas, not whinnying with us. And pictureless books in which small boys, though warned with quotations not to, would skate on Farmer Giles' pond, and did, and drowned. And books that told me everything about the wasp, except why.
Go on with the useless presents.
Bags of moist and many-colored jelly babies, and a folded flag, and a false nose, and a tram conductor's cap, and a machine that punched tickets and rang a bell. Never a catapult. Once, by mistake, that no one could explain, a little hatchet, and a celluloid duck that made, when you pressed it, a most unduck-like sound, a mewing moo that an ambitious cat might make who wished to be a cow, and a painting book in which I could make the grass, the trees, and the sea, and the animals any color I please. And still the dazzling sky blue sheep are grazing in the red field under the rainbow-billed and pea-green birds, hard-boiled, toffee, fudge, and all sorts, crunches, cracknel, humbugs, glaciers, marzipan, and butter Welsh, for the Welsh, and troops of bright tin soldiers who, if you could not fight, could always run, and snakes and families, and happy ladders, and easy hobby games for little engineers, complete with instructions. Oh, easy for Leonardo. And a whistle to make the dogs bark to wake up the old man next door, to make him beat on the wall with his stick, to shake our picture off the wall.
What else? What did I do?
And a packet of cigarettes. You put one in your mouth and you stood at the corner of the street and you waited for hours in vain for an old lady to scold you for smoking a cigarette. And then with a smirk, you ate it. Yes, yes, a sweet all along. And then it was breakfast under the balloons.
Were there uncles like at our house?
There are always uncles at Christmas. The same uncles. And on Christmas mornings, with dog disturbing whistle and sugar fags, I would scour the suave town for the news of the little world. And find always a dead bird by the post office, or the white deserted swings, perhaps a robin, all but one of his fires out. Men and women waiting, scooping back from the chapel, with taproom noses and wind-bust cheeks, all albinos, huddled their stiff black jarring feathers against the irreligious snow. Mistletoe hung from the gas brackets in all the front parlors. There was sherry and walnuts and bottled beer and crackers by the dessert spoons, and cats on their fur bouts watched the fires. And the high heaped fire spat, all ready for the chestnuts and the mulling pokers. Some few large men sat in the front parlor without their collars. Uncles, almost certainly, trying their new cigars, holding them out judiciously at arm's length, returning them to their mouths, coughing, then holding them out again as though waiting for the explosion. And some few small ants, not wanted in the kitchen, nor anywhere else for that matter, sat on the very edges of their chairs, poised and brittle, afraid to break, like faded cups and saucers.
Free and born. There is a battle of free and born. Come swiftly and run. Right before the souls of the village. Jesus is sleeping in his cradle. Beautiful is the mother. Beautiful is her son.
Not many those mornings trod the piling streets. An old man always, fawn-bowlered, yellow-gloved, and at this time of the year with spats of snow, would take his constitutional to the white bowling green and back, as he would take it wet or on fire on Christmas Day or Doomsday. Sometimes two hale young men with big pipes blazing, with bagpipes blazing, big pipes blazing, no overcoats and wind-blown scarves, would trudge, unspeaking, down to the forlorn sea, to work up an appetite, to blow away the fumes, who knows, to walk into the waves until nothing of them was left but the two curling smoke clouds of their coiling up to my nostrils, when out of a snow-clogged side lane would come a boy, the spit of myself, with a pink-tipped
I hated him on sight and sound, and would be about to put my dog whistle to my lips and blow him off the face of Christmas, when suddenly he, with a violent wink, put his whistle to his lips and blew so stridently, so high, so exquisitely loud, the gobbling faces, their cheek bulged with goose, would press against their tinseled windows the whole length of the white echoing street.
For dinner, we had turkey and blazing pudding. And after dinner, the uncle sat in front of the fire, loosened all buttons, put their large, moist hands over their watch chains, groaned a little, and slept. Mothers, aunts, and sisters scuttled to and fro bearing tureens. Auntie Bessie, who had already been frightened twice by a clockwork mouse, whimpered at the sideboard and had some elderberry wine. The dog was sick. Auntie Dozy had to have 3 aspirins, but Auntie Hannah, who liked port, stood in the middle of the snowbound backyard singing like a big-bosomed thrush. I would blow up balloons to see how big they would blow up to, and then when they burst, which they all did, the uncles jumped and rumbled. In the rich and heavy afternoon, the uncles breathing like dolphins and the snow descending, I would sit among the festoons and Chinese lanterns and nibble dates and try to make a model man-of-war following the instructions for little engineers and produce what might be mistaken for a seagoing tram car.
Or I would go out, my bright new boots squeaking into the white world on to the seaward hill, to call on Jim and Dan and Jack, and to pad through the still street, leaving huge, deep footprints on the hidden pavement.
I'll bet people will think there've been hippos.
What would you do if you saw a hippo coming down our street?
I go like this, bang! I throw him over the railing and I roll him down the hill, and then I tickle him under the ear and he'd wag his tail.
What would you do if you saw 2 hippos?
Iron flanked and bellowing, hippos clanked and battered through the scudding snow toward us as we passed Mr. Daniel's house.
Let's post Mr. Daniel a snowball through his letterbox.
Let's write things in the snow.
Let's write, Mr. Daniel looks like a spaniel all over his lawn.
Or we walked on the white shore. Can the fishes see that it's snowing?
The silent one-clouded heavens drifted on to the sea. Now we were snow-blind travelers lost on the North Hills, and vast dew-lapped dogs with flasks around their necks ambled and shambled up to us, baying Excelsior.
We returned home through the poor streets where only a few children fumbled with bare red fingers in the wheel-rutted snow and catcalled after us, their voices fading away as we trudged uphill into the cries of the dock birds and the hooting of ships out in the whirling bay. And then, at tea, the recovered uncles would be jolly, and the ice cake loomed in the center of the table like a marble grave. Auntie Hannah laced her tea with rum because it was only once a year.
Bring out the tall tales now. that we told by the fire as the gaslight bubbled like a diver. Ghosts, like owls in the long nights when I dared not look over my shoulder. Animals lurked in the cubbyhole under the stairs where the gas meter ticked. And I remember that we went singing carols once when there wasn't the shading of a moon to light the flying streets. At the end of a long road was a drive that led to a large house, and we stumbled up the darkness of the drive that night, each one of us afraid, each one holding a stone in his hand in case, and all of us too brave to say a word. The wind through the trees made noises as of old and unpleasant, and maybe web-footed men wheezing in the caves. We reached the black bulk of the house.
What shall we give him? Hark the herald?
No, said Jack. Good King Wenceslas. Count three.
1, 2, 3. And we began to sing, our voices high and seemingly distant in the snow-felted darkness round the house that was occupied by nobody we knew. We stood close together near the dark door.
Good King Wenceslas looked out on the feast of Stephen, when the snow lay round about, deep and crisp and even. Brightly shone the moon that night, though the frostness grew well, when poor men came in sight, gathering together. Bring me flesh and bring me wine, bring me time was hither. Thou and I will see him dine, when we bear the thither. Aged monarch, forth they went together. Through the woodlands wild lament, and the bitter weather.
And then a small, dry voice, like the voice of someone who has not spoken for a long time, joined our singing. A small, dry, eggshell voice from the other side of the door. A small, dry voice through the keyhole. And when we stopped running, we were outside our house. The front room was lovely. Balloons floated under the hot water bottle gulping gas. Everything was good again and shone.
It was a ghost, Jim said.
Perhaps it was trolls, Dan said, who was always reading.
Let's go in and see if there's any jelly left, Jack said. And we did that.
Always on Christmas night, there was music. An uncle played the fiddle, a cousin sang Cherry Ripe, and another uncle sang Drake's drum. It was very warm in the little house. Auntie Hannah, who got on to the parsnip wine, sang a song about bleeding hearts and death, and then another in which she said her heart was like a bird's nest. And then everybody laughed again, and then I went to bed. Looking through my bedroom window, out onto the moonlight and the unending smoke-colored snow, I could see the lights in the windows of all the other houses on our hill and hear the music rising from them up the long, steadily falling night. I turned the gas down. I got into bed. I said some words to the close and holy darkness, and then I slept.
Silent night, holy night, all is calm, all is bright, round yon virgin mother and child, holy infant so tender and mild, sleep in heavenly peace, sleep in heavenly peace.
performers, Debbie Radigan, Chris McCarthy, Nell Ball, Bill Murray, Claire Nolan Sky, and Don Kelly on guitar. So we wanted to open this up to all of you now to hear some of your Christmas memories. Dylan Thomas shares several of his with us. It must make you think of some funny stories, some sweet stories from when you were young. Who wants to start?
When it snowed for 12 days or 6 days and 12 minutes.
Chris, do you want to at least tell your family story?
Sure. So A Child's Christmas in Wales is very special to my family. When my sisters and brothers and I got a little bit older, my mother started the tradition of playing Dylan Thomas's recording of A Child's Christmas in Wales every Christmas Eve night. We would have a big dinner and sit around the tree afterwards and listen to it. And he had a beautiful mellifluous voice, and you hear the stories. My mother was very fond of Dylan Thomas. In fact, his wife was named Caitlin, and he named my youngest sister after Dylan Thomas's wife. It became particularly resonant for my wife, Kathy, and me, because we lived in Manhattan for about 15 years. And Meg mentioned at the beginning that unfortunately Dylan Thomas had a problem with drinking, but one of the places he used to haunt and hang out was the White Horse Tavern on Hudson Street, which was a place my wife and I used to frequent with some friends of ours. Fortunately, we got past 39 years old, but it also drew us closer to Dylan Thomas to think that we would sit out at the picnic tables on a warm evening and wonder if Dylan Thomas had sat there once years later. So we thought of him in the nice weather and on Christmas Eve as well. So there's a special place for us.
Thank you.
Very nice.
Any other stories to share? Oh, come on.
Kind of a strange story. I don't know if it's just a memory, so what it's worth. During my grade school years, I lived in Chicago, Chicago, South Halsted, and we had more snow then than we do now. And one of those Christmases I remember, a lot of things I don't remember, but I remember going down the street with a sled to get a tree. And I don't know if it was because it was Christmas Eve and there weren't any left, or my dad didn't want to spend much money, but we brought home the scraggliest tree of the time. He promptly set it up, cut off the bottom branches, drilled holes in the trunk, placed them nicely in, and made a nice, well-straight tree. And that was one of the most vivid memories I have of Christmas.
Well, I have a vivid memory. It isn't funny, it's just beautiful. When me and my brother were growing up, we were very young, maybe 6 and 7 years old. My mother and father would read from a big, an old Christmas book they had. They would read the night before Christmas. My father would do one section, my mother would do the other. And we were just into it completely. And then when that was done, my mother would always do the poem of the Little Match Girl. And that remained vivid in my mind for the longest time, of that little match girl lighting a match, and the light was keeping her warm. And I never forgot that. And I was only about 6 or 7 years old. And then it was a movie, a cartoon or something. About the Little Match Girl. It just kept in my mind, and I still have the book, which was written in maybe it was a Christmas book. It was done in the late 40s, and it was handed down through the generations, and I still have it at home. It's hardcover Christmas book of stories for children. And that remained in our minds from I was 6 and 7 years old.
And you still remember.
And oh yes, I still have the book, and I look at it usually on Christmas, around Christmas time, and read those those two stories and think of my parents.
Sure.
Wonderful memory.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Maybe you could give us another song.
Yeah, I actually, we have a thought, we have a memory?
Go ahead, and then.
It's not a Christmas memory per se, it's a Welsh memory, and it was in December, so.
Pretty good.
We were visiting a friend of mine, Mark. Mark was in a small village outside of Wrexham. And the first night we were there, he took us to a miners club, which was really cool. You had to get signed in by one of the miners to enter the club. But the second night there, we got introduced to the Welsh tradition of the lock-in, which is when, because of licensing hours, they require the pub to close. But if you're there and you're drinking and you're pretty good customers, they'll just lock the doors and close the shutters, and you just carry on. And that night I ended up doing a fairly decent rendition, I think, of Old Man River. I don't really remember it well enough to say that it was a decent rendition. I got a good response. But anyway, it was a lovely experience there outside of Wrexham.
Oh, nice. Oh, that's great.
I have a story that's actually a song. And it was written by a friend of mine, a real close friend of mine, and some of you folks may remember Christopher Shaw and Bridget Ball. And they used to have Mountain Snow and Mistletoe, and they performed that in various places, Troy Music Hall, the Egg. But Chris and Bridget retired several years ago. But one of the songs that Chris, and he was from Lake George, and he loved the Adirondacks, and he's an Adirondack singer. And he wrote this song, and some of you may have heard this song before, but it tells the story of a time back in the 1940s, way up in the Adirondacks. And there was a ranger, John Roberts, and he was an old time ranger up there. And he noticed, and it was back then in the 1940s, it was still illegal to chop down a pine tree or a Christmas tree. And so there's this story shows the compassion, whether it's true or not, I'm not sure, but I love the song, and it tells a beautiful story of a person's compassion and generosity, and that on the part of John Roberts. It's called $10 Christmas. So I hope you enjoy it, and I hope the guitar is loud enough. It was the first snow of the year, and all that you can hear was your own footsteps in the wet and heavy snow. It was almost 40 years John Roberts, a ranger around here. He's the sort of man everybody knows. Headed home on Friday night, fading winter night, the weekend and Christmas on his mind. In the freshly fallen snow, there was the footprints of old Joe and a spruce stump, fresh cut and left behind. Your Carson never had much luck, some might say he had it rough. 7 children, never had steady jobs. But John stood at his door, he clenched his teeth, then he swore not even this man should stand above the law. So in the steamy room inside where puppies ran and babies cried, he hit Carson with a stiff $10 fine. Carson said, "That cleans me out." Johnny had his doubts on Christmas morning, what Joe's kids might find. As he headed toward the door, he spied a pup there on the floor. He picked it up, turned to Carson once again. He said, "My nephew wants a pup. Looks like decent luck. I'll take this one." Handed Joe a 10. Later on that Sunday night, on a corner neath the street light, doesn't John run into Joe on his way home? He said, since the other night, when you came by, it's been a sight. I sold a pup now. What's that go to show? News travels fast here in the woods, Joe. Hope your Christmas was good. For a moment, they just stood there in the snow. Then Joe stuck out his hand and he said, I hope your Christmas was grand. Merry Christmas to you, Johnny. Merry Christmas to you, Joe. $10 Christmas.
Anybody have a request for a song or another story to share?
Can you do I wonder if I want, I wonder as I wander?
I don't know that one.
Okay.
I wonder as I wonder. It's a good one for me to look up. Sorry.
You mastered Old Man River. Can you give us a verse?
I'll tell a story. It's I could tell a lot of Christmas stories, but